I'll defend you. The black maid who saved a mafia boss after his lawyer abandoned him in court. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. In a bustling courtroom, the tension was palpable. The clock ticked steadily as the judge looked down at the defendant's empty chair, an ominous silence hanging in the air. The mafia boss, Dominic was waiting for his lawyer to make his appearance. But time passed, and there was no sign of him. No one knew where the lawyer had gone, and Dominic was left to face the charge alone. In the back of the room, an unassuming figure stood near the door. A woman in a simple black dress, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had been working for the Vitali family for years, quietly tending to their home, making sure everything ran smoothly. Her name was Imani, and though she had never been involved in the dangerous world of her employers, she had always respected their rules. But today, things were different. As the minutes dragged on, Imani felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew something had gone wrong. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. A few feet away from her, the prosecutor was preparing to make his case, his smug smile reflecting his belief that this was an open and shut situation. It was then that the moment of truth arrived. The doors to the courtroom swung open with a creak, and everyone turned toward the entrance. Dominic stood, his tall figure towering over the crowd, his face a mask of calm. But beneath that calm, Imani could sense the storm brewing. He had been abandoned. His lawyer, the one person who was supposed to defend him, had disappeared without a trace. Imani's heart pounded in her chest. She had never been a part of the criminal world, never understood the nuances of the law, but today, she knew she had to do something. She couldn't stand by and watch the man she had worked for, someone who had treated her with respect for so many years, be crushed by his own lawyer's betrayal. As the prosecutor began his opening remarks, Imani's eyes flicked to the defense table. There was no lawyer. There was only Dominic, alone, with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Without thinking, she moved forward. She wasn't supposed to be here, in the middle of the courtroom, but something inside her snapped. She couldn't let this happen. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her as she made her way down the aisle, the murmurs growing louder with every step. When she reached Dominic, she leaned in close and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "I'll defend you." The words hung in the air, more powerful than any legal argument she could have made. Everyone turned to look at her. The judge paused, the prosecutor's words faltered, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Imani didn't know what would happen next, but she had made her decision. She would fight for him. She would save him, no matter the cost. The mafia boss, once untouchable, now had a defender, a woman who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by standing up for what was right. As the judge stared down at the unexpected turn of events, Imani braced herself for whatever would come next. The story had only just begun. The courtroom fell silent, the tension so thick that it felt like the walls were closing in. Imani stood tall in front of the judge, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no legal training, no idea how to navigate the complex world of law, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let Dominic face this alone. The prosecutor, stunned by her sudden appearance, blinked several times before regaining his composure. The judge, a seasoned man who had seen his fair share of criminal cases, raised an eyebrow at Imani's audacity. It wasn't every day that someone from the defendant's staff decided to step into the spotlight, especially with the gravity of the situation. Imani's voice, though shaky, carried through the room. "Your Honor, I'll defend him." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Dominic turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes, usually hard and calculating, softened for the briefest of moments. He didn't know what had come over her, but in that instant, he knew she was serious. He had always respected her quiet strength, but this was something else. "You have no legal expertise," the prosecutor scoffed, clearly trying to assert his dominance in the room. "This is a court of law, not a place for maidservants to make foolish declarations." Imani's eyes never wavered from his. She wasn't about to back down. "I may not be a lawyer, but I know right from wrong. And I know that this trial, this entire case, is based on lies. She glanced at Dominic, then back at the prosecutor. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The words were bold, but they carried an underlying truth that no one could ignore. The judge, sensing the shift in the room, cleared his throat and addressed Imani. You may not be a lawyer, but if you truly wish to intervene, you will need to prove you have the ability to do so. This court doesn't entertain theatrics. Imani nodded, her mind racing as she tried to find the right words. She wasn't here to put on a show. She was here to save Dominic, to prove that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth would always prevail. She took a deep breath before speaking again. I'm not here to play games. I'm here because I've seen the truth. I've seen the evidence that has been hidden from this court, the facts that have been manipulated to serve someone's agenda. She paused, the weight of her words settling over everyone in the room. And I'm here to expose it. The room erupted in whispers, the shock of her declaration rippling through the crowd. But Dominic remained silent, watching her with a mix of disbelief and something else, something he couldn't quite place. The judge nodded slowly, clearly intrigued by the turn of events. Very well, he said. You may present your evidence. But understand, if you fail to substantiate your claims, you will face contempt of court. Imani nodded once more, her resolve strengthening. She turned to the defense table and reached for the stack of papers that had been left behind by the missing lawyer. As her fingers brushed against the documents, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She had seen these papers before. She knew every line, every clause. But something about them felt off, as if they had been altered. She flipped through the pages quickly, her mind racing. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady now. I have here the original contract, the one that was signed by Dominic Vitali's lawyer. And I can prove, without a doubt, that it was tampered with. This document was not the one that was presented in the initial meeting. A murmur of disbelief spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor looked like he might choke on his words, his confident demeanor faltering. What are you implying? He demanded. Imani didn't flinch. I'm implying that this entire trial is based on false pretenses. The documents you're relying on were forged to incriminate Dominic. And I can prove it. She took a deep breath and began to lay out the evidence she had gathered over the past few days. The crowd grew silent as Imani spoke, her words clear and precise. She detailed every discrepancy, every alteration in the documents that had been filed against Dominic. She explained how the contract had been manipulated to make it seem as though he had made illegal deals with rival organizations, when in fact, the original contract had been completely different. The room was still for a long moment. The prosecutor looked at the judge, then back at Imani, his mouth open in disbelief. Dominic, meanwhile, felt something stir inside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. He hadn't expected this from Imani, but she had come through for him in a way no one else had. The judge looked over the papers Imani had presented, his face unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. This is highly irregular, he said slowly. But I have no choice but to suspend this trial for further review. The evidence presented by this woman cannot be ignored. As the judge called for a recess, Imani looked at Dominic, who now stood with a quiet respect in his eyes. She had done what no one else could. She had saved him, not through force, but through truth. And as they left the courtroom, Imani knew this was only the beginning. The game had changed, and the Mafia boss now owed his life to someone who had once been nothing more than a maid. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind them, the chaos outside still ringing in Imani's ears. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. It had only been a few hours since she had stepped up in front of the judge, presenting the evidence that had shaken the very foundation of the case against Dominic. Her hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline, but she stood taller now, her resolve solidifying with every step. Dominic walked beside her, silent for the first time all day. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, but there was something different about the way he looked at her now. Respect? Gratitude? Perhaps both. As they reached the elevator, Imani couldn't help but steal a glance at him. You did it, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Dominic's eyes flickered to hers for a brief moment before he nodded. No, you did it. You saved me, Imani. I owe you more than I can say. She shook her head, the weight of the words she had spoken still settling in her chest. I didn't do it alone. It's your fight too. The elevator doors slid shut, and for a moment, There was nothing but the soft hum of the descending lift. Neither of them spoke again until they reached the parking garage. As they walked toward the sleek black car waiting for him, Imani couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. It couldn't be. There was still a long road ahead. When they reached the car, Dominic paused and turned to face her. His expression was serious now, the usual cool demeanor replaced with something deeper. "I want you to work for me," he said, his voice low but firm. Imani blinked, surprised by the offer. She hadn't expected this, not in the slightest. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want you to leave the life you've been living. I want you to be part of my team. You've proven today that you're capable of more than just cleaning. I need someone like you." His words hung in the air between them. Imani didn't know what to say. She had worked for the Vitali family for years, doing everything from cleaning their mansion to running errands. But to work directly for Dominic? That was a whole different ballgame. She had seen the way his world worked from the inside, and it wasn't a place she was sure she belonged. But then again, when had she ever really belonged anywhere? Her thoughts raced as she tried to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. She had walked into that courtroom as nothing more than a maid, and now here she was, standing before the most powerful man in the room, being offered a chance to change her life. The question was, did she want to? She looked at Dominic, searching his face for any hint of ulterior motives. But all she saw was sincerity. "What exactly would I be doing?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Dominic leaned against the car, crossing his arms. "You'd be more than just an assistant. I need someone who can think on their feet, someone who understands the value of loyalty and integrity. I need someone I can trust to watch my back, someone who isn't afraid to speak up when things go wrong. And most importantly, I need someone who understands the cost of doing what's necessary, even when it's hard." Imani felt a lump form in her throat. She had always been the quiet one, the one who did as she was told, never asking questions, never pushing back. But this was different. This was a chance to stand up for herself, to finally be more than just a background player in someone else's story. It was a chance to take control of her own fate. She looked at Dominic for a long moment, considering the weight of his words. Then, without hesitation, she spoke. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Dominic's eyes softened, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "You won't regret it," he said, his voice warm, though there was a hint of something else beneath the surface. "But know this, Imani. This world is dangerous. It's not for the faint of heart. Once you step into this, there's no going back." She nodded. "I know. I'm ready." Dominic's smile widened, and he gestured for her to get in the car. "Then let's get started." As Imani slid into the car, she couldn't help but feel a sense of uncertainty settle over her. But it was different this time. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was part of something bigger, something that could change everything. And, as the car pulled away from the courthouse, she knew that this was only the beginning. The days following Imani's decision to work directly for Dominic were a blur. The weight of her choice settled on her shoulders as she stepped into a new world, one where power and danger collided at every turn. No longer just a maid, no longer just an observer in the shadows. She was now part of something much bigger, something more dangerous. The first few weeks felt like a whirlwind. Dominic didn't waste time. He gave her tasks that challenged everything she knew. At first, it was simple, managing meetings, organizing his schedule, sorting through confidential files. But soon, the tasks grew more complex. She was tasked with overseeing deals, running background checks on important clients, and even attending high-level meetings with other powerful figures. She had always known that Dominic was more than just a mafia boss. He was a mastermind. His mind worked like a well-oiled machine, calculating every move, anticipating every possibility. But Imani saw something else beneath the surface, a vulnerability that no one else seemed to notice. It was in the way he held his silence during meetings, in the way his gaze would flicker to her just for a moment, as if seeking something only she could give him. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship. It was a connection, a trust that had formed in the aftermath of the courtroom. And she felt it too. The bond between them had deepened since that day. As the days passed, Dominic began to open up to her in small ways. He would talk to her about his past, about his childhood growing up in the shadow of his father's criminal empire, about the things he had done to survive, to take control. He shared stories of betrayal, of loss, and of the loneliness that came with being a man of power. Imani listened, always offering quiet support, always trying to understand the man who had once been untouchable. But she knew that the more she learned, the more she became entangled in his world. The risks were growing, and she couldn't ignore the danger that loomed over them. One night, as they sat in his office going over some documents, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Dominic's expression immediately changed, becoming cold and unreadable. "Come in," he said, his voice a low command. The door opened, and a man in a suit stepped inside. Imani didn't recognize him, but the way Dominic's eyes narrowed told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a friendly visit. The man's name was Marco, and he was one of Dominic's most trusted associates. He stepped forward, his face tense. "Boss," he began, "we have a problem. A shipment that was supposed to arrive today hasn't." Dominic's jaw tightened. "Explain." Marco hesitated for a moment before continuing. "It was intercepted. Someone tipped off the police. We don't know who yet, but they're in possession of the cargo." Dominic stood up from his desk, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He moved with the fluid grace of a man used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. Imani could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. She had seen Dominic in action before, but tonight, something was different. There was an urgency in his movements, a fire in his eyes. "Who's responsible?" he demanded. Marco shook his head. "We don't know yet, but we're working on it." Dominic's eyes flickered to Imani, and for a moment, their gazes locked. She knew what he was thinking. He was already planning his next move. But this time, it wasn't just about the shipment. It was about trust. It was about loyalty. And it was about protecting those who had proven their worth. "Imani," Dominic said, his voice softer than before. "I need you to handle something for me. You're going to oversee this operation. I'm going to need you to coordinate with the team and find out who's behind this. I trust you." The weight of his words hit her like a freight train. He trusted her. The man who had built an empire from the ground up, the man who had destroyed enemies with a single word, was now placing his faith in her. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a test, and Imani was ready for it. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and surveillance. Imani found herself deep in the underworld of Dominic's business, working alongside his associates to track down the people responsible for the shipment. The further she dug, the more she realized how complex this world was. But as the pieces began to fall into place, she started to uncover something even darker, something that could unravel everything Dominic had worked for. She was getting closer. The tip-off, the police involvement, the person behind it all, it was all starting to make sense. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous the situation became. And with every new revelation, she couldn't help but wonder, what was Dominic willing to do to protect what was his? And more importantly, what was she willing to risk to stand by his side? Imani sat at her desk, the weight of the situation settling heavily in her chest. The last few days had been a blur of phone calls, covert meetings, and constant surveillance. She had dug deeper than she ever imagined, pulling strings in the underworld of Dominic's empire. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it became. The people responsible for the intercepted shipment were no small players. They were connected, powerful, and ruthless. And now, Imani was at the center of it all, tasked with solving the puzzle before things spiraled out of control. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Marco, one of Dominic's most trusted men. "We've got a lead. Meet at the warehouse tonight. Midnight." Her heart skipped a beat. She had known it was coming. Dominic had been pushing for answers, and now the pieces were falling into place. This was it. She stood up, grabbing her coat from the back of the chair, and made her way to the car. As she drove through the dark streets of the city, her mind raced. This wasn't just about a stolen shipment anymore. This was about loyalty, trust, and the darkness that followed Dominic everywhere. Imani had been working with him for weeks now, and though she still felt like a stranger in this world, she couldn't deny that something inside her had changed. She wasn't just doing this job for Dominic anymore. She was doing it for herself. The car slowed as she neared the warehouse, its looming shadow casting an ominous feeling over the scene. The place was quiet, too quiet. She parked the car in a dark corner of the lot, the only light coming from the flickering street lamps above. When she stepped out, her senses went on high alert. This wasn't just another routine meeting. She could feel it in her bones. As she approached the entrance, Marco's figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light inside. He didn't say a word as she stepped inside, but his eyes told her everything she needed to know. Something was off. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he led her deeper into the warehouse, where several of Dominic's men were gathered around a table, speaking in hushed tones. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of the situation pressed down on Imani. She noticed the table was covered with blueprints, plans for the shipment, the police involvement, and something else. Something that caught her attention. A name. Volkov, she said quietly. Marco's eyes shifted toward her. "You know them?" Imani nodded slowly. "I know of them. They're dangerous." The room went silent, and Imani felt the eyes of every man in the room on her. The Volkov family was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, and now, they were involved in the stolen shipment. It wasn't just a matter of protecting Dominic's empire anymore. It was a full-scale war brewing beneath the surface. "What do we do now?" Imani asked, her mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. Marco's face hardened. "We fight back. We're not going to let them take what's ours." But as he said the words, Imani couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be as simple as a direct confrontation. The Volkovs were calculated, and they would never make a move without knowing exactly what was at stake. Imani knew they needed to outsmart them, not just outmuscle them. As the night wore on, Imani and the others strategized, going over every possible move they could make to regain control of the situation. But with every plan they discussed, the stakes only seemed to grow higher. They weren't just fighting for the shipment anymore. They were fighting for their lives. By the time the sun began to rise, Imani was exhausted, both physically and mentally. She hadn't signed up for this, but now she was in it, deeper than she had ever imagined. She had to trust Dominic. She had to trust that the man who had brought her into this world would do whatever it took to keep them safe. But as she left the warehouse that morning, her phone rang. It was Dominic. "Imani, I need you to stay close," his voice came through the line, calm but with an edge of urgency. "The Volkovs are making their move. I don't want you anywhere near them." Imani's heart sank. "What's going to happen?" "We're going to handle it. But you're too valuable to be caught in the crossfire." Imani clenched her fist, a surge of anger rising within her. She wasn't going to sit on the sidelines anymore. She had been trusted with too much, learned too much, to back down now. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, her voice carrying a resolve she hadn't known she had. "I'm in this until the end." There was a brief silence on the other end of the phone before Dominic spoke again. "All right, stay close. We'll be in touch." Imani ended the call and looked out at the city in front of her. The calm before the storm had settled, but she could feel the pressure building. The Volkovs wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and Imani wasn't about to let them take it without a fight. The days following Imani's decision to stand by Dominic's side were a constant battle, one that played out behind closed doors, in shadows, and in silence. The Volkov family's move was imminent, and every minute brought them closer to a confrontation that neither side was ready for. Imani knew what she was up against now. She wasn't just working for Dominic anymore. She was entrenched in a war. She had seen the depths of the Volkovs' reach and their ruthless ways, and it terrified her. Dominic had told her to stay close, to avoid the front lines, but she couldn't do that. She had crossed too many lines now, seen too much to back out. She was part of this fight, whether Dominic liked it or not. It was late when Marco called. He was the first to break the silence that had enveloped them since the last strategy meeting. "We've got a lead on their next move," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to move fast." Imani didn't hesitate. "Where?" "Warehouse on 4th Avenue. Midnight. Be ready." She hung up, her pulse racing. Everything had been building up to this moment, their first real strike against the Volkovs. There was no turning back now. Imani gathered her things quickly, her mind already running through the plan. She knew this wasn't just a raid, it was the beginning of something much larger, something that could escalate in ways they weren't prepared for. But she also knew that if they didn't act now, they would lose everything. Dominic's empire, their lives, everything. As she drove to the location, the city passed in a blur. Her mind was sharp, focused. There was a coldness in her that hadn't been there before. The fear of what was to come had been replaced by something stronger. She was ready. When she arrived at the warehouse, the scene was exactly what she had expected. Chaotic, tense, a sense of danger hanging thick in the air. Marco was already there, waiting with a few of Dominic's most trusted men. They were armed, prepared for whatever came next. Dominic wasn't with them, but his presence was felt in every corner of the room. His orders were clear. This was a mission of survival. Ready? Marco asked when he saw her approach. Imani gave him a nod, her eyes scanning the surroundings. What's the plan? Marco briefed her quickly. We've identified their contact. We know who's pulling the strings behind this. We take them out, and we take back what's ours. And Dominic? Imani asked. Marco paused, then spoke, his voice low. He's handling things on his end. We're on our own for this one. The weight of the responsibility hit Imani, but it didn't slow her down. She understood the stakes now. This wasn't just a game for power or money. It was a fight for survival. They were fighting for their lives, and that meant no one could afford to be weak. They made their way through the darkened warehouse, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the old concrete floor. Imani could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what was to come. Every corner they turned brought them closer to their target. It felt like a trap, one they had walked right into, but there was no turning back now. As they neared the back of the warehouse, Imani caught sight of their target, a tall, broad-shouldered man standing by a stack of crates. He had his back to them, unaware of their presence. Marco motioned for them to stay quiet as they crept closer. Imani's heart raced, but she kept her composure. This was what they had trained for. As they reached the target, Marco made the first move. He stepped forward, his gun raised. But the man turned just in time. Shots rang out, echoing through the empty warehouse. Imani ducked, instinctively reaching for the gun she had tucked into her waistband. The firefight that followed was a blur of motion and noise. She moved quickly, taking cover behind the nearest crate, her mind working fast to calculate her next move. She could hear the gunfire in the distance, but it wasn't until the warehouse doors suddenly slammed open that she realized things were escalating faster than they had planned. More Volkov men flooded into the building, their guns drawn. Marco cursed under his breath as he ducked behind a pile of boxes. "We've got to get out of here," he shouted. But Imani was already moving. She had seen enough of Dominic's world to know that running wasn't an option. They were in this until the end. She pulled herself up, aiming her gun at one of the Volkov men advancing on their position. A single shot rang out, and the man fell. She didn't hesitate, moving swiftly to take out the next target. But just as she turned to fire again, she felt a sharp pain in her side. She gasped, stumbling slightly, but kept moving, her focus sharp despite the blood that was beginning to soak through her shirt. She couldn't afford to slow down, not now. Not when everything was on the line. The Volkovs were ruthless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. But Imani wouldn't let that happen. Not if she could help it. She took another shot, knocking down a second man before darting behind a stack of crates for cover. Marco was at her side a moment later, his face grim. "You all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Imani nodded, though her breathing was shallow, her body aching from the wound. "We have to finish this," she said, her voice firm. "We're not leaving without the intel." They fought their way through the warehouse, the sounds of gunfire deafening in the chaos. As they reached the final set of crates, Imani saw the man who had been pulling the strings, the Volkov mastermind. He was standing at the far end, his back to her, talking to someone on the phone. Imani raised her gun, her finger on the trigger. But before she could take the shot, she heard a voice. "It's over." She turned quickly to see Dominic standing at the entrance, his presence commanding. The fight had ended, and it was time for the Volkovs to pay for what they had done. The air in the warehouse felt thick with the aftermath of battle, the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy as the final echoes of gunfire faded. Imani stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, blood still seeping from the wound in her side. She didn't feel the pain, not yet. Not with everything that had just happened. Marco was by her side, his face set in grim determination, but there was no time to check for injuries or even take a breath. Dominic was here, and with him, things were about to shift. As the Volkov mastermind, the man responsible for this entire mess, cowered on the ground, hands held high in surrender, Dominic stepped forward, his presence commanding. He had always carried an aura of power, but now, in the midst of this chaos, it was undeniable. His gaze flicked toward Imani, and for the first time since this began, she saw something other than the steely resolve in his eyes. She saw relief. Get him up, Dominic ordered, his voice cold but steady. Marco and the others immediately began to drag the Volkov man to his feet, despite his protests. Dominic was unfazed. Imani, still shaking from the adrenaline, looked at Dominic as he walked over to the captured enemy. She had been through hell with him, and now they were standing at the precipice of something bigger. This wasn't just about the shipment anymore. It was about dominance. It was about ensuring that no one dared to cross Dominic Vitali again. What do we do with him? Imani asked, her voice raspy from the tension. Dominic didn't even glance her way. We make an example. It was chilling how easily he spoke those words. As the men secured the Volkov leader, Dominic turned back to Imani, his eyes narrowing slightly. You did well. I wasn't sure what to expect, but you showed me something I hadn't seen in you before. Imani felt a lump form in her throat. His praise, though cold, though calculating, meant something to her. She had risked everything to stand by his side, and now she was being recognized for it. I'm not here for the praise, she replied, her voice steady, though she still felt the burn of exhaustion from the fight. I'm here to make sure we win. For both of us. Dominic's gaze softened ever so slightly, though it quickly hardened again as he turned his attention back to the Volkov man. I don't trust the Volkovs, he said, his voice low. This is just the beginning. They'll come after us harder now, but they're not going to like what happens next. Imani knew what he meant. The Volkovs were not the kind of family to back down. They would retaliate, and it would be up to Dominic and his people to crush them before they got the chance. Dominic's eyes flicked over to her once more, his expression unreadable. I'm giving you more responsibility from here on out. No more sidelines. No more standing back. Imani met his gaze without hesitation. She had expected this. She had known that her place in his world was never going to be simple. And now, it seemed, she was becoming more than just an assistant, more than just a confidant. She was becoming part of the plan. She nodded. What do you need from me? I need you to keep digging. We need to know everything. Who tipped off the police? Who's involved in this? He paused, his gaze narrowing. Who else is working with the Volkovs? Imani nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. She could feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders, but it was the kind of weight she had learned to carry. She wasn't afraid anymore. I'll find out, she said, her voice firm. Dominic watched her for a moment longer, as though deciding something. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he motioned toward the exit. Let's go. We've got work to do. As they left the warehouse, Imani's thoughts were already on the next steps. This wasn't just about keeping the empire intact anymore. It was about taking control of the future. And Imani wasn't going to let anyone, especially the Volkovs, take it away from them. The streets outside were quiet, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Dominic was preparing for the storm that was coming, and Imani would be right there by his side. The war was just beginning, and there was no going back now. The morning after the warehouse raid was quieter than expected. Imani woke up in her small apartment, the weight of the events still pressing on her chest. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the firefight, the Volkov leader's pleading eyes, and Dominic's steely gaze as he took control of the situation. But today, things were different. The Volkovs weren't the only threat now. There was something darker in the air, something that Imani couldn't shake. The phone call came just as she was finishing her coffee. It was Dominic. We've got a problem, he said, his voice sharp. Meet me at the office. Now. Imani's heart skipped a beat. She quickly gathered her things and headed out the door. When she arrived at the office, the mood was tense. Dominic stood by the window, his back to her. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a hard edge that she hadn't seen before. What's going on? She asked, walking toward him. He turned to face her, his eyes intense. It's not over. The Volkovs are more dangerous than we thought. Someone tipped them off about the shipment. They've got people on the inside. Imani's stomach dropped. How do you know? Dominic's jaw tightened. I've got sources. The Volkovs wouldn't make a move this big without help from someone who knows our operation. I'm going to find out who. And then what? Imani asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. Dominic's gaze softened for a moment before hardening again. We deal with them. But first, we need to protect what's ours. I can't afford any more surprises. Imani nodded. She knew what that meant. They couldn't afford to be blindsided again. She had seen the Volkovs in action, and they were relentless. Dominic was right. This was far from over. What do you need me to do? She asked. Dominic glanced at her for a moment, as if weighing his options. I need you to handle something delicate. We've got a mole in our ranks. I need you to find out who it is. Imani's pulse quickened. The thought of betrayal from someone within their own ranks made her stomach turn. But she knew the job had to be done. She had been thrust into this world, and now there was no turning back. How do you want me to find them? She asked. You've proven you can dig into things and get answers, Dominic said. I want you to start with our inner circle. Someone has been feeding information to the Volkovs, and I need to know who before they strike again. Imani nodded, her mind already working through the logistics. She would have to approach this carefully. Every move had to be precise. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. As the day wore on, Imani began her investigation. She reached out to a few trusted people within Dominic's organization, quietly asking questions, observing their behavior, looking for any sign of suspicion. It wasn't easy. Everyone was on edge, and the tension in the air was palpable. But she knew what she was looking for. As the hours passed, Imani found herself narrowing down the list of suspects. One name kept popping up: Victor, a senior associate who had been with Dominic for years. He was trustworthy on the surface, but something about his recent behavior didn't sit right with her. He had been out of town for a few days when the shipment was intercepted, and he had seemed oddly distant when he returned. Imani knew she needed to dig deeper. That night, she followed him, keeping her distance as he made his way through the city. He didn't go home like she expected. Instead, he headed toward a quiet alley, where a black SUV waited. Imani's heart raced as she watched from a distance. She couldn't make out what was happening, but the sight of the car made her stomach twist. Was he meeting with someone? Was he the mole? She waited in silence, holding her breath. After a few tense minutes, Victor stepped into the SUV, and the car sped off into the night. Imani didn't waste a second. She pulled out her phone and texted Dominic. I've got a lead. I think I know who the mole is. We need to talk. Dominic's reply came almost immediately. Stay on it. We'll meet tomorrow. Be careful. Imani couldn't shake the feeling that she was closer to the truth than ever before. But the danger was growing. As she made her way back to her car, she realized that the walls were closing in. The Volkovs, the mole in their ranks, it was all connected, and it all led back to Dominic. The question was, could she get to the bottom of it before it was too late? The following day, the atmosphere in the office was different. The tension was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Imani couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on them. Dominic had always been the one to control the situation, but now, it was clear that the stakes were higher than ever. She was sitting in his office, reviewing the latest intel, when he walked in. His expression was unreadable, his usual confidence replaced with something else, something darker. Imani looked up from the papers, meeting his gaze. You're sure about this? She asked, her voice steady despite the unease that gripped her. Dominic nodded slowly, his jaw tight. I'm sure. The mole is closer than we thought. Victor is the only one who's been out of town during the key moments, and he's been acting strangely ever since. We need to deal with this. Imani's mind raced. If Victor was the one betraying them, it would mean everything they had worked for could come crashing down. She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was adding up. So what's the plan? She asked. Dominic paused, looking at her with a mixture of respect and something unreadable. We confront him. We find out who he's working with, and we end this before it gets worse. Imani nodded, already feeling the weight of the responsibility settle in her chest. She had been through a lot since she first walked into Dominic's world, but this was different. This wasn't just about loyalty anymore. It was about survival. As they prepared to take action, Imani couldn't help but think about everything that had led them here. She had trusted Dominic from the start, but now, the lines between right and wrong were starting to blur. Was she just a pawn in his game, or had she become something more? Her thoughts were interrupted when Dominic's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then looked back at Imani. It's Victor, he said. He's here. We need to move now. They left the office, and as they made their way through the building, Imani felt the tension in the air rise. This was it. The confrontation they had been waiting for. As they reached the main floor, Imani saw Victor standing near the elevator, looking casual, as if he didn't have a care in the world. He turned when he saw them approach, his expression shifting from friendly to guarded. Dominic, Imani, he said, his voice smooth. What brings you here? Dominic didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, but commanding. Victor's eyes flicked to Imani, then back to Dominic. "About what?" "About you," Dominic replied, his tone colder now. "About the Volkovs and everything you've been hiding." Victor's expression faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. Imani could see the guilt in his eyes. She had seen that look before, on people who had something to hide. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victor said, trying to play it cool. But Imani could see the sweat on his brow, the way his hands fidgeted with the sleeve of his jacket. "You're lying," Imani said, stepping forward. "We know everything. We know about the tip-off, about the shipment, about the inside information you've been giving the Volkovs." Victor's face turned pale, but he quickly recovered. "This is insane," he said, his voice shaking now. "You don't know what you're talking about." Dominic stepped closer, his voice dark and full of authority. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, and I'm giving you one chance to come clean. Tell us who you're working with, or I'll make sure you regret it." Victor hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as though looking for an escape. Imani could feel the pressure building, the silence stretching out as they waited for his response. Finally, he broke. "It's not just me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was working with someone higher up. Someone you wouldn't suspect." Dominic's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "Who?" "It's Gabriel Castellano," Victor confessed. The name hit Imani like a punch to the gut. Gabriel Castellano was the head of one of the most powerful rival families in the city, a man who had been a thorn in Dominic's side for years. If Victor had been working with him, it meant everything they had fought for was now in jeopardy. Dominic's expression didn't change, but Imani could see the rage simmering just beneath the surface. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded. Victor swallowed hard. "Since the beginning. He promised me power, control, everything I ever wanted. I didn't think it would go this far. I never thought." He trailed off, his voice shaking. Dominic's gaze hardened. "You should have thought harder." With a swift motion, he signaled to his men. "Take him away. He'll face the consequences of his betrayal." As the men led Victor out of the building, Imani turned to Dominic. Her heart was still racing, her mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. Gabriel Castellano, working with Victor. It was a game-changer. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the shock. Dominic looked at her, his expression hardening even more. "Now we go after him. We take down Gabriel Castellano once and for all." The sun had barely risen when Imani arrived at the safe house. The night's events felt like a blur, yet the reality of what they were about to do had never been clearer. Gabriel Castellano was no longer just a name on a list of rivals. He was now a direct threat to everything Dominic had worked for, and it was time to act. Imani stepped out of the car, the cool morning air biting at her skin as she walked toward the building. Dominic was already inside, his figure a dark silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. He was always early, always calculating. She knew that today's mission was different. This wasn't a simple raid or a routine cleanup. This was personal. It had to be. Gabriel Castellano had betrayed them all, and there would be no turning back. Imani walked into the safe house, the scent of coffee filling the air. Dominic was sitting at a table with a stack of documents in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his eyes sharp. "You're here," he said, his voice low. "We have work to do." Imani nodded, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had known from the beginning that working with Dominic would push her to her limits, but she had never anticipated it would get this deep. They were standing on the edge now, and there was no going back. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. Dominic pushed the papers aside, leaning back in his chair. "We're going after Castellano's operations. His empire is built on lies, and it's time to tear it down piece by piece. I need you to help me infiltrate his network. You're the only one who can do it. The mole, Victor, he gave us the connections, but you're the one who can make them work." Imani took a deep breath. The idea of going undercover was nothing new to her. She had done it countless times for Dominic, but this felt different. She was about to walk into the lion's den. "What exactly do you need me to do?" she asked. Dominic met her gaze, his eyes intense. "I need you to get close to Castellano's inner circle. Find out who's loyal to him and who's been feeding him information. Once we know that, we can make our move." Imani nodded. She had always been good at reading people, and this was no different. But what worried her wasn't the task. It was what would happen when she found the truth. "And you?" she asked. "What are you going to do?" Dominic's gaze hardened. "I'll handle the rest. You get in, get the information, and I'll take care of the cleanup. No one leaves this unscathed." Imani didn't need to ask what he meant by that. She had seen it before, the cold, calculated way he handled business. He didn't leave loose ends. They spent the next few hours going over the details of the plan. Imani would be posing as a potential ally to Castellano, someone who could provide him with new opportunities for expansion. She would use every skill she had, her intelligence, her charm, and her ability to read people, to get close to Gabriel's most trusted associates. She would get the information they needed to bring Castellano down. By the time the plan was set, Imani felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. This was the kind of job that could make or break everything. If she failed, it wouldn't just be her life on the line. It would be Dominic's empire. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Imani had to change everything about herself to fit the role she was about to play. She was no longer the quiet, obedient maid. She was a businesswoman, a strategist, and a force to be reckoned with. As the day of her meeting with Castellano's people drew closer, Imani could feel the nerves building inside her. But she knew that if she showed fear, it would all be over before it even started. She had to be confident, composed, and above all, convincing. When the day finally arrived, Dominic gave her a final look, his eyes filled with a mixture of trust and something else, something that looked almost like concern. "Remember, Imani," he said, his voice low, "this isn't just about getting the information. It's about making sure we don't leave anything behind. Do what you need to do to get close to him, but don't forget why you're there." Imani nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I won't forget." As she made her way to the meeting, her mind raced through everything she had prepared. The car ride felt like an eternity, each minute bringing her closer to Gabriel Castellano, and each second increasing the stakes. She arrived at the location, an upscale restaurant known for its exclusivity. It was exactly the kind of place Castellano frequented. She walked inside, her steps deliberate, her expression cool. The moment she saw the group waiting for her, she knew that this wasn't going to be easy. Castellano's men were smart, sharp, and not easily fooled. But neither was she. Imani took a seat at the table, offering a polite smile. She was already in character, already playing the part of the woman who had the answers they needed. She was ready for the game. And as she shook hands with the men across from her, she knew that this was the beginning of the end for Gabriel Castellano. But the question remained. How far was she willing to go to make sure the game ended on her terms? Imani sat across from the men in Gabriel Castellano's inner circle, her composure barely hiding the tension building in her chest. The luxurious restaurant hummed with quiet conversations, the clinking of silverware, and the soft rustling of napkins, but it felt like she was in the middle of a storm. She had successfully walked into the lion's den, and now the most important game of her life was unfolding. As she took a sip of her wine, she kept her mind focused, the plan she and Dominic had devised clear in her thoughts. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to gather information, to expose the cracks in Gabriel's empire. Gabriel Castellano wasn't in the room yet, but Imani knew he'd be joining them soon. His men, sitting across from her, eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They had been briefed about her, of course. She wasn't just any woman walking into their midst. She had something they wanted, and they didn't yet know whether to trust her. She smiled politely, maintaining her poise, waiting for the right moment to make her move. The clock on the wall ticked quietly in the background, and it wasn't long before the door to the private room opened. Gabriel entered, his presence filling the space like a shadow. His eyes immediately landed on Imani, sharp and calculating. She held his gaze, offering a smile that bordered on friendly but carried an unmistakable air of confidence. He paused for just a moment before taking his seat at the head of the table, his men parting slightly to make way for him. "I see we have a new player in the game," Gabriel said, his voice smooth but laced with an edge. Imani felt the weight of his words, but she didn't let it show. "I'm just here to talk business," she replied, her voice steady, her tone matching his calm confidence. Gabriel studied her for a moment, then gestured to the men sitting around the table. "Gentlemen, we've been discussing expansion, and I believe our guest here might have something to offer." Imani raised an eyebrow slightly, pretending to be intrigued. I'm always open to new opportunities, she said, leaning forward slightly. She knew that every word she spoke had to be carefully chosen. She wasn't here to just play along. She was here to manipulate, to control the narrative. What do you have in mind? She asked, keeping her voice low and measured. Gabriel smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. There are many ways to expand, he said, his tone casual but dangerous. Some are more aggressive than others. Imani could feel the undercurrent of menace in his words, and she knew this was where the game would start. This was her opportunity to see how far Gabriel would go, to see how deep his loyalties ran, and to figure out who else he was working with. Aggression can be useful, depending on the situation, Imani said, carefully maintaining her calm demeanor. But I've always found that a more calculated approach often yields better results. Gabriel's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile remained. I can appreciate that. However, not everything in this world can be calculated. The conversation shifted, but Imani knew exactly where it was headed. They were testing each other, measuring each other's strengths and weaknesses. And she had to keep up. I've heard good things about you, Gabriel continued, his eyes scanning her face as though searching for something hidden. You have connections, influence. What exactly is it you want from me? Imani took a deep breath before responding. I want to ensure that the right people are in control. Power, at the end of the day, is about knowing who to trust. Gabriel's lips curled into a slight smile. Trust is a rare commodity, he said, but it can be bought. Imani's mind raced. She had been expecting this. Gabriel wasn't just after control. He was after loyalty, and he would do whatever it took to buy it. She needed to stay ahead of him, to keep the conversation moving in the right direction. Loyalty is important, Imani replied, her voice soft but firm. But it's not enough. You need more than loyalty. You need results. Gabriel nodded slowly, as if contemplating her words. Results, he muttered. Yes, that's what matters. The conversation continued, but Imani's mind was already working on the next step. She had gathered enough to know that Gabriel's operations weren't just built on power. They were built on manipulation. He used people, broke them, and then discarded them when they were no longer useful. It was a system of control, and it was the kind of system Dominic couldn't afford to let stand. As the evening wore on, Imani found herself growing more and more convinced that Gabriel was the key to dismantling the entire Volkov empire. She had to find a way to turn the tide, to expose the cracks in his foundation before it was too late. But just as she was about to make her move, something shifted in the room. Gabriel leaned in, his gaze locking with hers. You're clever, he said, his voice low, almost admiring. But let's see how far that cleverness will take you. Imani held her ground, her heart pounding. She had just entered the most dangerous phase of the game, and she had no intention of backing down. It was clear now, this was more than just business. This was a battle for control, and it would only end one way, with one of them standing and the other falling. The night was growing late when Imani finally left the meeting. The air outside felt colder, the city streets quieter, as if the events of the evening had already left their mark. Gabriel's words still echoed in her mind. Let's see how far that cleverness will take you. She had known he was testing her, but there was something more in his tone, something that made her realize he was beginning to take an interest in her, for better or worse. Dominic had warned her that getting close to Gabriel would come with risks, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly those risks would escalate. She had gathered more than she'd expected from the meeting. Gabriel was clearly a man who thrived on power and control, and his empire was held together by manipulation and fear. But there was a chink in his armor, his overconfidence. It was in the way he spoke about loyalty, about trust, as though he thought everyone around him could be bought, just like the men he kept close. Imani knew she had to play this carefully. She couldn't let Gabriel know how close she was to discovering everything he was hiding. She needed to stay in control, stay ahead of him. As she entered her apartment, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Dominic. Meet me at the office. We've got a problem. The words sent a cold chill through her. She had suspected that it was only a matter of time before things went south, but now the stakes were higher than ever. She quickly grabbed her jacket and left, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived at Dominic's office, she found him pacing, his face set in a hard, determined expression. He looked up as she entered, his eyes scanning her quickly, as if assessing her reaction to whatever news he had. What's going on? Imani asked, her voice steady, though she felt the knot tightening in her stomach. Victor's been talking, Dominic said, his voice cold. He's admitted to working with Gabriel Castellano. He's also told us that the Volkovs have been planning something bigger than just the shipment, something that could completely destabilize our operations. Imani's heart sank. She had known the mole was dangerous, but she hadn't realized just how far the Volkovs were willing to go to destroy them. What do we do now? She asked, her mind already turning with plans. Dominic's eyes narrowed, a glint of determination in his gaze. We need to get to Gabriel before he makes his move. We've been careful up until now, but it's clear we're running out of time. I need you to keep working your angle, Imani. Get close to him. If you can get him to trust you, we can turn the tables. Imani nodded. She had already known this was coming. Dominic was placing everything on the line, trusting her to get the information they needed. But she couldn't afford to fail, not now. I'll do what I can, she said, her voice firm. Dominic walked over to her, his expression softening just for a moment. I know you will. But remember, Imani, this isn't just about loyalty. It's about survival. We're playing a dangerous game, and there's no room for mistakes. Imani met his gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always known Dominic was ruthless, but now she was fully immersed in his world, a world where trust was scarce and loyalty was bought with blood. As she left his office, the gravity of the situation pressed down on her. She was playing a dangerous game with Gabriel Castellano, and if she lost, it wouldn't just cost her life, it could cost everything Dominic had worked for. The next few days were a blur of strategy and preparation. Imani kept her distance from Gabriel's men, maintaining the carefully crafted facade she had built over the last few weeks. She was playing her part perfectly, but every interaction with them felt like a step closer to the edge. She couldn't let her guard down, not once. But then came the unexpected. Late one evening, Gabriel called her. I need to see you, he said, his voice low and commanding. Now, Imani's pulse quickened, but she didn't hesitate. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had to act, and she had to act fast. When she arrived at the location, a private, upscale apartment that Gabriel often used for meetings, she was ushered in by his men without question. Gabriel was already inside, waiting for her. He didn't greet her with the usual pleasantries. Instead, his expression was serious, almost stern. I've been thinking, he said, his eyes scanning her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You're not like the others. You don't play by the same rules. Imani raised an eyebrow, maintaining her composure. I'm here to do business, Gabriel. Nothing more, nothing less. Gabriel's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was something unsettling in his eyes. Business, yes, but I think you're playing a much bigger game. You've been working for Dominic Vitali, haven't you? The question hit Imani like a punch to the gut. She had suspected that Gabriel was sharp, but this was something else. He had known all along. She fought to keep her expression neutral, to hold on to the mask she had so carefully crafted. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice steady, but she could feel the lies sitting heavy in her stomach. Gabriel didn't flinch. Don't lie to me, Imani. I've known from the moment we met. You're too smart, too resourceful to be working for someone like him without a reason. But I admire your courage. Imani's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her cool. Gabriel had cornered her, and now it was up to her to find a way out of this. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice low but firm. Gabriel's smile widened. I want you to join me. Imani stood there, the weight of Gabriel's offer hanging heavy in the air. His words echoed in her mind. I want you to join me. She had always known that getting involved with him would come with a price, but now the choice was laid bare before her. The man across from her, the same man who had orchestrated a plan to destroy everything Dominic had built, was offering her a chance to align with him. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Gabriel's gaze was intense, measuring her, waiting for a response. But Imani had no intention of rushing into anything, not yet. She had come too far to let herself be swayed by his charm, by his power. Her mind raced, the stakes higher than ever. She had been playing this game with Dominic, but now Gabriel was throwing a wrench into everything she thought she knew. The loyalty she had shown to Dominic, the trust he had placed in her, felt heavier now. Could she betray him? Could she turn her back on everything she had worked for? Her thoughts were interrupted as Gabriel leaned forward, his voice soft, almost coaxing. I know what you're thinking, he said, and I understand. Dominic has offered you power, but with me, you could have everything. I could give you control, a seat at the table, where the real decisions are made. The temptation was there, clear in his words. It was a promise of more than just survival. It was a promise of dominance. Imani's heart pounded as she processed his words, but she couldn't let her guard down now. She had always known that trust was a dangerous thing in this world. The moment you let someone in, they had the power to destroy you. She wasn't sure if Gabriel was offering her power or if he was offering a trap, and she wasn't willing to walk into it blindly. What makes you think I would join you? Imani asked, her voice steady, but her mind swirling with possibilities. Gabriel's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Because you're smart. Because you know that the world we live in is one where only the strongest survive. You can see it, can't you? Dominic's empire is crumbling. His empire is based on trust, on alliances. But alliances can break. And when they do, there's no one left to protect you. Imani remained silent, her eyes fixed on him. He was right about one thing. The world they lived in was unforgiving, and Dominic's empire was built on fragile trust. But there was something more to Dominic than what Gabriel saw. Dominic had something that Gabriel would never understand. Loyalty. A loyalty that ran deep. A loyalty that would hold even when everything else was falling apart. I'm not interested in playing your game, Gabriel, she said, her voice firm. Gabriel's smile faltered for a brief moment before returning, though it was colder now, sharper. I see. You've chosen your side. There was no surprise in his tone, just the recognition that he had lost this round. You know, I always respect those who don't betray their own. But remember, Imani, loyalty is a double-edged sword. And I've never been afraid of a blade, Imani replied without hesitation. Gabriel's eyes flashed with something like respect, but his words were filled with warning. You'll regret this, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality. You can't stand against me and expect to win. No one does. Imani didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth was clear. Gabriel Castellano's world was built on power, on fear, on manipulation. But that was not the world she wanted to live in. She had come too far, and she had made her choice. As she turned to walk out of the apartment, she felt the weight of the decision settle in her chest. But there was no turning back now. She was committed. When she stepped out into the cold night air, she didn't feel the same unease that had followed her for so long. She knew that the next move would be Dominic's, and she would stand by his side. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But she knew one thing for certain. The battle with Gabriel Castellano was far from over. And as much as Dominic had trusted her, she was beginning to realize how much trust she would have to place in him if they were going to survive. The war had just begun, and she was ready for whatever it would take to end it. As she made her way back to the safe house, Imani's mind was already planning the next steps. She would need to be more careful now, but she had no doubts about the path ahead. There was no room for hesitation in this world. And when it came to choosing between loyalty to Dominic or falling for Gabriel's offer of power, there was no question. Dominic had shown her a side of this world that no one else could, and that made all the difference. She was in this until the end. If you are looking for compelling romance stories that delve deep into the emotional struggles and triumphs of complex characters, then this series is for you. The story follows the journey of Imani, a woman caught between loyalty and temptation as she navigates a world of power, betrayal, and hidden agendas. As she becomes entangled with Dominic in the dangerous world of organized crime, the line between right and wrong blurs, leading her to make life-changing decisions. These romance stories are not just about love, but also about the choices that shape destinies. As Imani faces her challenges, the stakes grow higher, with unexpected twists that reveal the darker side of passion and loyalty. The tension between the characters is palpable, and as they confront their enemies, the emotions run deep, keeping you hooked till the very end. In this tale, trust, power, and love collide. And through it all, the romance stories at the heart of the narrative shine through, keeping you on the edge of your seat. Each decision Imani makes brings her closer to either destroying her future or claiming the life she's worked hard for. With every passing chapter, the drama intensifies, and these romance stories unravel the complexities of love amidst danger. As the story builds to its climactic conclusion, Imani's path leads her to face her greatest fears, proving that love and loyalty come with a cost in this thrilling journey of romance stories.